What you doing, kid?
Snug.
Snug. Okay. The change in temperature roused Pemer, his mouth dry and sour, his body stiff. He couldn't think for a moment where he was or why he ached, and his guts rumbled. He sat bolt upright as he remembered and felt inside his tunic for the beragged egg. He tore the covering in his frenzy to check the precious shell, and was trembling with relief when he touched its warm shape. The quick tropical dusk was nearly on him, the vivid glimmer of the sun coating the foliage about him with gold. He heard the lap of water and, peering toward the sound, realized that he was close to a beach. The call of a nest homing wary startled him as he crept stiffly from under his bush. He knew he'd have little time and light to settle the egg in warm sand for the night. He staggered to the beach, praying it would be a sandy one, crying out in relief when he saw that it was, dropping to his knees to burrow into the warm sand and bury the egg safely. Wearily he built a pile of rocks to mark the spot, and then pulled himself back to the jungle, using the last light to locate a tree with orange fruit. The first few he batted down from the branches with the long stick were too hard to be edible. Another fell with a liquid splot. He scooped up the overripe fruit and swallowed it down, grimacing at the slightly rancid taste. Then he managed, after several more attempts, to get 2 edible fruits. Barely satisfied, he propped himself against the tree's trunk and slept fitfully through the night. Pemer stayed in that area all the next day, resting, washing his scratched and bruised self in the warm seawater, rinsing out his stained and torn clothes. He had to seek the concealing shelter of the forest several times as first fire lizards and then dragons flew overhead. He was too close to the weir, he realized, and he would have to move on. But first, something to eat. More orange fruit and red fruit, which seemed to grow in profusion. He also picked up several dried hulls, one for carrying water and another for carrying his fire lizard egg buried in warm beach sand. When he saw fire lizards and dragons returning to the weir, he waited for a spell before he retrieved his egg, packing it well in the hot sands, and headed westward, away from the weir. Afterwards, he never could figure out why he felt the weir and the southern hold were dangerous to him. He just felt he ought to avoid any contact with them, certainly until his egg had hatched and he had impressed his own fire lizard. It wasn't logical, really, but he'd endured a harrowing experience, and had already been in the role of the hunted, and so he continued to run. The first moon rose early and full, lighting his way along the shore, up the rocky banks and steep sand dunes. He traveled on, occasionally eating fruit as he plodded and pausing 3 times for a small nap, but each time anxiety snapped him wakeful and set him on his way again. The second moon rose, doubling the quantity of light but striking curious shadows against its companion that often made Pemer detour around rocks made gigantic by mismatched illumination. He knew that strange things could happen to travelers under the double moons, but he persevered until both moons had set, and the darkness forced him to seek refuge under the trees, where he'd be safely hid if he slept, and dawn came before he knew. He woke when a snake crawled over his legs, scraping against his bare skin where the trousers had been torn. He clutched feverishly at the egg, for snakes liked fire lizard eggs. The sand about his precious possession was cool, and that brought him to his feet. He emerged onto a small cove, baking in a mid-morning sun. He scooped out a hole and buried his egg, marking the spot with the upturned fruit shell ringed by beach stones. Then he returned to the jungle to seek his breakfast and water. The diet of fresh raw fruit was affecting his digestion, and he spent some uncomfortable moments before he realized he would have to have something else to eat. He remembered what Manoli had said about fishing from her cave in the Dragonstones, and he hadn't so much as a line. Then he noticed the thick vines clinging to tree trunks and viewed the thorns on the orange fruit trees with new sight. Using his belt knife and a little ingenuity, he shortly had himself a respectable fishing line. He baited his hook with a sliver of orange fruit, having nothing better. The western arm of the cove had been swept into a long rocky hook, and Pemer climbed and scrambled to the furthest point. Casting his hook and line into the foaming waves that lapped the base of the rock, he sat down to wait. It was a long time before he had any luck in landing a fish, though he had pulls on several occasions that lost him his bait. When he finally hauled in a medium-sized yellowtail, he had every right to be jubilant and think longingly of roast fish. But as he rose from his cramped position and turned, he realized he'd been very stupid. His rock was now isolated from the cove's arm by active surf. With a shock, he realized his second mistake. He had buried the egg in sands that would shortly be underwater. His yellowtail was considerably mangled by the time he had paddled, jumped, and splashed ashore. His immersion in salt water had disclosed another short-sightedness on his part. His face, particularly his nose and the tips of his ears, had been badly sunburned, as well as the parts of his body showing through rents in his tunic. He rescued his egg first, burying it in the shell with the hottest sands he could scoop about it. Then he hurried on to the next cove in a spot well above an obvious high tide mark. It took him time, too, to find rocks that would spark and light his fire of dried grasses and twigs. Eventually he got enough of a blaze, and he stretched the gutted yellowtail over the fire to broil, barely able to contain his impatient hunger until the meat darkened. Never had fish tasted so sweet and delectable. He could have eaten 10 or 12 the same size and not had too much. He gazed longingly out at the sea, and to his disgust saw fish leaping out of the waters as if to tantalize him. Then he remembered that Manoli had said the best times to fish were sunrise and sunset or after a hard rain. No wonder he'd had such a wait, fishing at midday. His face and hands burned now from too much sun, so he hiked deep into the woods that lined the beach, looking for fresh water, for ripe fruit, and seeing in the luxurious undergrowth familiar but oddly outsized leaves of tuber plants. Experimentally, he yanked on a handful of stems, and up came a huge tuber root, which he dropped when he saw the small gray grubs that swarmed over it. But they disappeared quickly back into the rich loam, leaving clean the enormous white tuber. Suspiciously, Pemer picked it up and examined it from all sides. It looked all right, even if it was much bigger than any tuber he'd ever seen. He was certainly hungry enough to eat all of it. Taking it back to his dying fire, he fed the flame to a good height, washed the tuber in some of his precious fresh water, and sliced it thinly. He toasted the first slice on the end of his knife and broke off a tiny piece for judicious tasting. Maybe it was his hunger, but he decided he'd never tasted such a delicious tuber, crisp on the outside and just soft enough on the inside. He made quick work of cooking the remaining slices and felt immeasurably better. Retracing his steps, he found tubers in quantity, but took only what he could carry. When the tide had begun to recede from his boulder that evening, he splashed out to it again and was rewarded with several yellowtails of respectable size. He broiled 2 for his dinner, toasted another huge tuber, and then undug his egg, arranging it in its carrying shell with plenty of warm sand. He walked that night again until both moons had set. When he found a place to sleep on dried tree fronds, he arranged himself so that the rising sun would shine in his face and wake him. That way he would be up in time to catch fish. He followed this routine for 2 more days and nights, until the last night he realized that for some time he had seen no fire lizards, nor dragons, nor any other living creature except wind-borne wild wherries soaring high above the ground. He told himself that the next day, as soon as he found fresh water in a good cove with a wide sandy beach well above high-water markings with convenient fishing points, he would settle. The egg was perceptibly hardening and surely must be close to hatching time. That evening he began to wonder why he had continued moving away from Holden Weir. Of course, it was kind of fun discovering each new cove and the vast stretches of sandy beach and rocky strand. To be accountable to no one except himself was also a new experience. Now that he had enough to eat and some variety of food, he was enjoying his adventure very much indeed. Why, he'd wager anything that he'd set foot on places no other person had ever trod. It was exhilarating to be first at something, instead of following others and doing just what every other apprentice had done before him, turn after turn after turn. He fished in the morning, catching a pat-tail and being mindful of Manoli's experience with the tough, oily flesh as he gutted it. He smeared oil on face and body to ease the rough skin the sun had burned, reasoning that if Manoli had used fish oil for her fire lizard's flaking hides, it would do as well for his. Retrieving and inspecting his precious egg, he was now certain it must be close to hatching. The shell was so rock-hard. He packed it in the fruit shell with warm sand and proceeded westward, striking off through the shadier forest for a while. At mid-morning he stumbled out of the shade onto a wide expanse of gleaming white sand that forced him to squint against its glare. Shading his eyes, he saw a lagoon, partially sealed off from the sea by a jagged barrier of massive rocks, which must once have been the original coastline. Carefully climbing along that rocky arm, he could see all kinds of fish and crawlers in the clear water, trapped there against the higher after the higher tides had retreated. Just what he needed, his own private fishing pond. He retraced his steps and continued along the beach. Parallel to the point where the lagoon broke into the sea, he discovered a small stream emerging from the jungle, feeding into the lagoon. He followed it far enough up its course to clean water untainted by the sea. He was jubilant and amazed that anywhere in this world of sun, sea, and sand could exist that was exactly right to suit his requirements, and it was all his. Here he could stay until his egg hatched, and he'd better make the right preparations for that event now. It wouldn't do to miss impressing simply because he had no food for the hatchling. Chaz, do you also want to cuddle with me some, or do you just... Okay. He had seen neither fire lizard nor dragons in the sky for the past 2 days, so afterwards he thought that might be why he had given no thought to Thread. In hindsight, he realized that he had known perfectly well that Thread fell on the southern half of Pern just as it did in the north. His preoccupation with the fire lizard egg and his efforts to supply himself with food had simply divorced him from the concerns and memories of life in Crafton Hall. He was fishing that dawn, lying prone on the grass pad he had made to protect his bare chest from the harsh rock surfaces, when he experienced a sudden sense of alarm so intense that he glanced over his right shoulder and saw in horror the gray rain hissing into the sea not a dragon's length beyond. He remembered later that he glanced for the reassuring sight of flaming dragons just before he realized that he was completely unprotected from Thread, whether dragons were in the sky or not. That same instinct sent him plunging into the lagoon. Then he was in the midst of violent activity as half the fish in the ocean seemed to crowd against him, eager to consume the Thread that was diving to feed them. Pemer propelled himself up out of the water, flailing his arms to keep water about his body in the notion that water might protect him from Thread, as he gulped air into his lungs. His shoulders were stung while he fell back under the water. He pushed himself down again, but before long he had to repeat the cycle of emerging, gulping air into his laboring lungs, then retreating to a depth that was free of viable Thread. He'd done this 6 or 7 times before he realized that he couldn't sustain such activity for the length of threadfall. He was dizzy with lack of oxygen, pinpointed by thread score that burned and stung in the salty water. Manoli had at least had a cave in which to shelter, and if he could find it, if it were sufficiently above the surface of the lagoon at this time of the tide, there was an overhang of rock. He desperately tried to place its location on the lagoon arm the next time he surfaced, but he could barely see with his eyes red and stinging. He was never sure, in the midst of panic and anxiety, how he found that meager shelter, but he did. He scraped his cheek, right hand and shoulder in the process, but when the redness cleared from his eyes, his nose and mouth were above the water, and his head and shoulders protected by a narrow roof of rock. Literally just beyond the tip of his nose, Thread sheeted into the water. He felt fish bump and dive against him, sometimes sharply nibbling at his legs or arms until he flailed the attacking limb and fish darted after their customary food. Part of his mind knew when the menace of Thread had passed, but he remained where he was until the cloud of falling Thread moved beyond the horizon and the sun once more shone in unoccluded splendor on a peaceful scene. The terrified core of his soul, however, was slower to acknowledge that danger was over, and he remained in the shelter of the ledge until the tide had receded, leaving him stranded like a white fish on his portion of the reef. Anxiety for his egg finally drove him from his sanctuary to check it in its beachy nest. The first scoop of sand he threw violently from him, for it contained hundreds of the gray squirming grubs. They reminded him so forcefully of Thread that he scrubbed his hands against his side. Could Thread have penetrated the egg? He dug frantically until he reached it. He caressed the warm shell in relief. Surely it would hatch any time now. Abruptly, he hoped it wouldn't happen just now. He had no fish handy, and with their bellies full, he doubted if he could catch any before sundown. If then, and how would he know precisely when the egg was going to hatch? Dragons always knew when a clutch was ready and warned their riders. Manoli said her fire lizards began to hum and their eyes whirled purple-red. He had no such forecasters to aid him. Seized by a sense of urgency, he foraged in the jungle for vines to make another line and thorns from the fruit trees for hooks. But just to be safe, he gathered some fruit and some tough-shelled nuts. Hatchlings needed meat, he knew, but he supposed anything edible would be better than an empty hand. It was while he was fitting the thorn hook to the end of the vine that the impact of the day started to hit him. His fingers trembled so that he had to pause. He, Pemer of... well, he wasn't a herdsman's boy anymore, and he wasn't a harper's apprentice either. Pemer of Pern. He, Pemer of Pern, he went on more confidently, had survived Threadfall, holdless. He straightened his shoulders and smiled broadly as he glanced proudly across his lagoon. Pemer of Pern had survived Threadfall. He had overcome considerable obstacles to secure a queen fire lizard egg. It would hatch, and he would, at long last, have a fire lizard all his own. He glanced fondly at the mound of sand that was his little queen. Was he certain, though, that it was a queen? Doubt assailed him briefly. If it wasn't, it might be a bronze, and that was every bit as good. But it had to be a queen egg, separated as it had been from the others warming by Lord Moran's fire. Pemer chuckled at his own stupidity. He ought to have realized that Lord Moran would present the eggs as the climax to his feasting. Of course the recipients would check, out of joy, or maybe out of distrust for Lord Moran's generosity. He really ought to have gotten out of the hold before the feast ended. How, he couldn't imagine, but he just might have done if he'd tried. Certainly he wouldn't now be isolated on the southern continent. He put a final twist in the vine to hold the thorn hook firmly. He gazed northward across the hazy sea in the general direction of Fort Hold and the Harper Hall. He'd been gone 8 days now. Had they tried to find him at Nabol Hall? He was a bit surprised that Sibel hadn't sent Kimi or Manoli's Rocky to look. But then, how was anyone to know where he was? North or south? And fire lizards had to have directions, just like dragons. Sibel might not have learned that Lord Moran was dealing with the Southerners, or that there had been a collection that night. A splash in the lagoon attracted his attention. The fish were back with the tide. He rose and made his way across the exposed rocks, affectionately patting the ledge that had sheltered him. It took him longer than usual to catch a fish that evening, and he only landed a small yellowtail, too small to satisfy his hunger, much less provide for a voracious hatchling. Soon the rising tide would isolate him on this section of the lagoon, so if he didn't hook shortly, he'd have to retreat to where the fishing was always poor. Controlling his impatience as best he could, for Pemer was certain that the fish heard sound, else why were they avoiding his hook? He also held his breath as he jerked his line in an imitation of live bait. That's when the curious noise came to his ears. He raised his head, looking about, trying to locate the source of that odd sound, so faintly heard above the lap of wave against the rock. He scanned the skies, thinking there might be wild wherries or fire lizards above him, or worse, dragon riders to whom he would be extremely visible, stretched along the reef rock. It was the movement on the beach that caught his eye, more than placing the sound there. Just then the line in his hand jerked. In a panic of comprehension, he nearly let go, but a reflex prompted him to haul the line in rapidly, rising to his feet as he did so, his eyes on the beach. Something moved on the sand. Near his egg! A sand snake? He picked up the first yellowtail, poked a finger in the gills of the hooked one, and made for the beach. Nothing was going to... Surprise and consternation halted him for one panic-filled instant as he saw the cause of the motion. A tiny, glistening gold creature flapping awkwardly across the sands, piteously screaming. Wild wherries materialized in the sky, drawn by some uncanny magnet to this birth moment. All you have to do is feed a hatchling. Manoli's calm advice rang in his ears as he stumbled across the sand and nearly fell on the tiny queen. He fumbled at his belt for his knife to cut up the fish. Use pieces about the size of your thumb, or else the hatchling will choke. Even as he tried to cut through tough fish scale, the little fire lizard darted forward, screaming with hunger. No, you'll choke to death, cried Pemer, pulling the fishtail from the fire lizard's grasp and hacking chunks from the softer flesh along the spine. Shrieking with rage at being denied food, the little queen began to tear at the fish flesh. Her talons were too burst soft to perform their function, so Pemer had time to slice suitable portions for her. I'm slicing as fast as I can! A race ensued then, between the hunger of the little queen and Pemer's knife. He managed to keep just a slice ahead of her voracity. When his knife opened the softer fish gut, she pounced, mumbling in her haste to consume it. Pemer wasn't certain if fish entrails, full of thread no doubt, were a suitable diet for a newly hatched fire lizard, but it gave him time to cut more flesh. He started on the second yellowtail, gutting it first to occupy her while he hacked rapidly at the flesh. He knew one was supposed to hold the fire lizard while one fed it to form the impression, but he didn't see how he could contrive that until he hadn't food enough to coax her into his hand. Finished with the offal, she turned back to him, her rainbow eyes glaring at him as they whirled redly with hunger. She gave a scream, opened her still wet wings, and dove onto the small mound of fish pieces. He caught her first, holding her body firmly just under the wings, and then proceeded to feed her piece by piece until she stopped struggling in his grasp. The edge of her hunger assuaged, she paused long enough to chew, and her voice took on a new, softer note. He loosened his hold and began to stroke her, marveling at the wiry strength in the slender body, at the softness of her hide, at the liveness of her, his very own fire lizard. A shadow crossed them, and the queen raised her head and rasped out a warning. He looked up and saw that the wherries had boldly circled down and were just above him, talons poised to grab. He waved his knife, the blade sparkling and glinting in the sun, frightening the wherries into wider, higher circles. Wild wherries were dangerous, and he and the hatchling were unprotected on the open beach. He gathered her carefully into the crook of his arm, grabbed the line from which the fish head still depended, and started to run toward the jungle. She shrieked in protest as he broke into a full run just as the wherry leader made its first pass. He sliced upward with his knife, but the wherry was clever, and adding its piercing scream to the fire lizard's, veered away from him. Holding the struggling queen against his chest, Pemer hunched his shoulders and concentrated on reaching the forest as fast as he could. He'd always prided himself on his speed. Right now, that ability had to save 2 lives. He saw the shadow of another wherry dive at them and swerve to the left, grinning with satisfaction at its shrill call of anger when it was balked of its prey. The queen's talons might not be dry, but they scrabbled painfully against his bare chest as she struggled to grab the fish head that dangled enticingly from the line in his hand. Pemer ducked right as he avoided a third wherry's dive, and the queen missed her lunge for the fish head. The fourth attack occurred so quickly that Pemer couldn't duck in time and felt a sharp pain as the wherry's talons scraped across his shoulders. Twisting upward, he slashed out with his knife, tripping as he did so and instinctively rolling to the right to protect his precious burden. He saw the wherries trying to veer fast enough to come at him on the ground, shrilling out that their prey had fallen and was at their mercy. The little queen was now aware of their peril, and slipping from his grasp, jumped to his shoulder, spreading her wings and screaming defiance at the attackers. She was so valiant, the little darling, so small in comparison to the wherries, that her courage gave Pemer the impetus he needed. He scrambled to his feet, felt her cling to his hair, her tail tightly wound around his neck, continuing her stream of defiant cries as if by her fury she could repel her attackers. Pemer ran then, pumping his legs as fast as he could, his lungs straining for breath to sustain the speed. He ran, expecting momentarily to feel the wherry talons rending his flesh. But abruptly their cries turned from triumph to fear. Pemer launched himself into the thick bushes, grabbed his queen to keep her secure. Safe under the wide leaves and among the thick stalks, he turned to see what had frightened their pursuers. The wherries were flying away as fast as they could flap their wings, and he had to crane his neck eastward until he saw a flight of fire lizards arrowing in pursuit of the wherries. Just as he drew back under the concealing bush, he saw 5 dragons gliding above the sea. His queen gave another cry, softer now, in protest that the fish head still dangled beyond her reach. Afraid that somehow the dragons might hear her, he gave her the head, which she contentedly tore and consumed, while Pemer watched the dragons circling the spot where she had lain and shelled. Without waiting to see if the dragons landed, Pemer pushed his way deeper into the jungle, trying to remember if Manoli had ever said anything about fire lizards tracing newly hatched ones. But fire lizards only knew what they'd seen, and he'd been under cover by the time the winged rescuers had reached the lagoon area. The wherry's shrieks would have masked any sound she'd made, and as Pemer plunged past thorn trees and undergrowth, her cries became softer. Weariness overcame the last vestiges of her shelling hunger. Pemer was more aware of her contentedness than his rasping breath as he continued to put as much distance between him and the lagoon and possible discovery, while light remained to guide him in the murky jungle. In the same hour, Kimi returned with a message from Torek, answering the harper's query about young newcomers in the southern settlement. The drum beat the news of Lord Moran's death. 8 days it's taken him to die, said the harper on the end of a long sigh, when Master Olddive thought 1. Determined to disoblige us, I imagine, said Sibel, dismissing the man as he concentrated again on Torek's message. No one has applied to him for shelter. There's been no outburst from the weir, which he certainly would have been made if a stowaway had been discovered. But that doesn't mean, said Sibel hurriedly, raising his hand to forestall Manoli's protest, that Pemer didn't get there. Torek says that the weir has been barred to his holders for the last 7 days, but his fire lizards imagined a pile of strange shapes by the weir hold, so he suspects that a shipment has arrived from the north. They don't let the mere holders in the weir grounds to celebrate. So if Pemer smuggled himself out of an old hole in one of the old-timer sacks, he also got out of it and made himself scarce. Which is sensible of Pemer, said the harper, idly twirling his wine-glass with one hand. His face was expressionless, but his eyes moved restlessly with his thoughts. Pemer would undoubtedly deem it discreet not to come to the old-timer's notice. At least not until that egg of his had hatched, added Manoli. She had so hoped that Pemer would have gone to Torek. She was certain he would know that Torek was friendly with the harpers. She turned to Sibel. Candler will let us know the instant the other eggs from the clutch have hatched, won't he? Yes, he said he would, the journeyman replied. But then he made a face, scratching his head. But we don't know if that queen egg came from the same clutch as the others. But we do know the others weren't Green's eggs. They were too big, and that's the only time scale we have to work with. I'm positive that Pemer won't attempt to seek anyone out until that egg has hatched, and he's impressed. I know I wouldn't if I were in Pemer's boots. I wish I knew he were all right. She beat her thighs with her fists at her helplessness. Manoli, said the harper soothingly, you're not responsible for... But I feel responsible for Pemer, she said, and then shot her master an apologetic look for interrupting him so rudely. If I hadn't encouraged his interest in the fire lizards, if I hadn't filled his ears with the pleasures they bring, he might not have been tempted to steal that egg and get himself into such a predicament. She looked up because both men started to laugh, and she exclaimed with exasperation at their callousness, Manoli, Pemer has been getting in and out of trouble since long before you arrived here, said Sibel. You and your fire lizards calmed him down considerably. But I think you're right about Pemer not showing himself until impressions have been made, and Torek is on the alert for him. He'll show up. Meanwhile, said the harper, rising from his chair and reaching for his flying gear, I'd best go and assist the new Lord Dector to secure his hold.